Yeah, so to start with, React was so cool that Jack took his jacket off, so it's so cool I'm going to take my shoes off. Don't worry, I'm not taking anything else. So yeah, I'm going to be geeking out about React Native. As you've probably got a bit of an understanding from Jack's talk, it was really great to see that he obviously was quite excited about React. And I think personally there's a lot to get excited about with this particular technology. So just a bit of background, I'm Colin Eberhardt, and I'm the technology director at a company called Scott Logic. Some of you may or may not have heard about us. We're a financial software consultancy. I'm actually from our Newcastle office, so this was a good excuse to come and visit Bristol, where we've also got an office as well. So that's me on Twitter. You can find me on GitHub and doing all kinds of things to avoid doing real work. So why React Native? So I got into React Native during the beta phase. So I do some writing for Ray Wenderlich, an iOS website. And I got asked to write about React Native, so I was lucky enough to get onto the beta. So I was excited about it from day one. But why might you consider React Native now? So if you've done any kind of mobile development, you'll know that there's one big problem with mobile development, is that there's lots of different smartphone types. You might have iOS, Android, and you might care about Windows Phone, but either way there are quite a few different types of smartphone. And there's been this kind of war raging for the past few years about which is the best way to do it. Should you go for native development or should you go for HTML5 development? And that war hasn't really been won by one or other side. There are still people that are very much in one or the other camp. The issue hasn't gone away. And the thing is, it's a little bit more complicated than that as well. It's not as black and white as native or HTML5. There are all kinds of different flavors in between. Yeah, I was going to do one of those cool talks where there's lots of funny pictures along the way. That's the only one I've got. So yeah, so there's mobile web, there's wrapped, there's native, hybrid, yada yada yada. There's loads of different ways of doing this, and it makes it very hard to determine which is the correct way to go. I tend to segment these technologies into two separate camps. There's the ones that deliver a HTML user interface, and there's the ones that deliver the native interface. And I don't really care about the subtle twists in between. And the reason for that is the HTML5 user interfaces, typically you're making some user experience compromises, whereas with the native you're going to get the best user experience. And I think compromise is a bit of a tainted word. If you use the right compromise, if it saves you money, you can still deliver the functionality you need to. Making the right compromise is a very good thing to do. So in the HTML camp, you might have seen some of these before: PhoneGap, Ionic, Famous, Kendo. There's loads and loads of different technologies. In the native, so all of these are different technologies that allow you to use a common language to deliver native user interfaces on iOS, Android, and some of the Windows Phone. So you've probably heard of some, but maybe not others: Titanium, Xamarin, Delphi, if you want to do Object Pascal. And then there's React Native. So again, why React Native? I first started looking at it, not necessarily because it was the best, but in my opinion it was by far the most cool, because it's got lots of really interesting technology sitting behind it. That's the only reason I started looking at it in the first place. It's got JavaScript, which I'm sure is everyone's favourite language here, so it gives you the kind of productivity you're used to, elegance, all the innovation and so on. Also, React itself is a pretty cool part of the JavaScript community. We'll see some of this stuff as we go along, things like hot reload, Babel, or Babel. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on with React Native. So that's why I first started having a look at it in the first place. So, how does it work? What I'm going to do is give you a little bit of an introduction to React again. And you're probably thinking, oh no, not again, you've already seen that. But I'm going to give you a slightly different introduction that will hopefully give you a little bit of a different perspective on what makes React so special. So I'm going to implement a very, very simple little application, and I'm first going to do it with just plain old vanilla JavaScript. And here's the application. It's a button that you can click. It tells you how many times you've clicked it, and after you've clicked it 5 times, for some reason, it goes pink. Don't ask me why. And if you were doing it with plain old JavaScript, and by plain old JavaScript, of course I mean jQuery. If you took it with plain old JavaScript, this is what it might look like. So basically, you've got some DOM, you grab reference to some of your nodes, you've got some state kicking around, you've got a function which updates the user interface. So you've got a function which takes the state and pushes it to the UI. You've then got event handlers, that handle events, update the state, and then tell it to update the user interface again. And then finally, on startup, you want to make sure the UI is in sync with your state. So roughly speaking, putting that in a diagram, you've got some model states and you've got your UI state, and there are these three separate pathways. There's first the initialization, then after user interactions occur, your model state is updated, and your UI state is updated once again. Nothing terribly exciting going on there. Now, because that's a bit of a pain, manually shuffling all the state around, and as you can see, it's a little bit inefficient in that you've got two different state transitions basically following the same path. Because that's a bit of a pain, people came up with a whole load of frameworks to help you out with that. And I've just picked one at random. It could have been Ember, it could have been Backbone, it could have been any of them, but I just chose Knockout on a whim. And again, it's exactly the same application. And this is, in the Knockout world, this is what it might look like. So this time, you've got a view model. So you've got a model that represents your state. And in this context, we use observables. So you have model properties that can be observed, and you've got bindings within your user interface. So you've got your model sitting over there, you've got your user interface, and you've got some magic that keeps them connected together. If you've not seen Knockout before, don't bother reading any of the details. Most of these frameworks are all the same. So in the vanilla JavaScript, these are the sort of paths that the data follows. With most frameworks, these complex paths are replaced by some kind of binding. So I showed you Knockout, but it could have been Angular, where you've got concepts of scope, which perform exactly the same function. But if we focus on Knockout, you've got some sort of clumsy property syntax. In Angular, you've got scope. Scopes aren't great. They're basically filling in for the fact that JavaScript properties aren't observable. And I know that there's an observable specification that was being proposed, I think for ES 2017 or something like that, but that's now been dropped, so it's not going to happen. So as a result, what you'd really want to do is just increment the number. In the Knockout land, you've got to do something a little bit convoluted. It needs observable arrays. You end up with some sort of templating or binding language, and you're under the slight misconception that you've now got separation of concerns because you've got model and you've got a template. But really, it's a separation of technologies. It's a separation of your JavaScript and your HTML. It's not a separation of concerns. So with ReactJS, again, I'll click the button just to prove to myself that it still works. Believe me, it's the different code behind each of these. And this is what it might look like. And the surprising thing here, I think, for some people is that there's more code here. You might think it's a bit less elegant. Now, I'm not going to dissect this. Hopefully from Jack's talk, you'll understand what's going on here. At the very core, you've got a render function which renders your current state as some DOM. And with React, the view is a transformation of the current state. And as an implementation detail of that, you've got what happens is your state is rendered to a virtual DOM, it performs a diff, and then it updates the real DOM. Very clever. Now, people argue, and I tend to agree, that this is a separation of concerns rather than technologies. So you might see things like CSS mixed in with your markup, but that's because they all belong to the same concern, and those concerns are wrapped up in components. So it's a different way of looking at how you build your UI. And I'll point you to a couple of talks and blog posts that I think, if you've not read them yet, you definitely should. One of them from Chris is about the reasoning behind why they embedded CSS within the JavaScript. You get things like dead code elimination, you get modularization of your JavaScript. It's a very sensible thing to do. The other one asks the question, is ReactJS fast? And I think when React first came out, people focused very much on the DOM diffing technology and focused on the fact that they thought it was really, really, really fast. And you're missing the point by just focusing on speed. So again, finally, to wrap it up in a little diagram, with most other UI frameworks, you've got your app state, and it's tightly coupled to the DOM. So you've got references to your DOM nodes, and the DOM nodes are causing events which are calling back into your code, and you've got this kind of tangled web going on between them. Whereas in React, what happens is it's more of a pipeline. Your application state is rendered to a virtual DOM, and the virtual DOM is then diffed, and it sends a optimized set of updates to the real DOM. So it's a pipeline rather than a kind of tangled mess. As a result, one of the great observations is unidirectional data flows are much simpler. So if you've ever done, for example, an Angular app, you might find yourself observing the scope and having some kind of side effect where something else will happen if a property changes, and then something else might happen, and something else might happen, and it starts to spiral out of control. And it's not just Angular that has that problem. If you've done C# development, you might have used iNotify property change in your C# code, and you'll have exactly the same problem. Your applications become harder and harder to reason about. And I've seen quite a lot of cases where people have put in little shortcuts. You'll have a little boolean is initializing to shortcut some of the side effects that occur, and the thing becomes a mess. With unidirectional data flows, that doesn't happen. And interestingly, Jack shared his slides beforehand, and he made almost exactly the same comment as this, and I'll make it again. What's cool about React is the concept, not necessarily the implementation. And also, I'll reiterate what Jack mentioned, that it's influenced other frameworks as well. Angular 2 is very much taking this component-focused approach. So, here's a quick question. If the DOM is decoupled, perhaps it can be replaced. So if we no longer have this deep and intricate relationship between the model state and the DOM, maybe we can replace the DOM with something else because they're sufficiently decoupled. So you might think the next slide is going to be React Native, of course, but it's not. Because React Native well, the React Native team weren't the first people to observe this. This is actually React Canvas. The Flipboard team, what they wanted to do was create a mobile site with some of the parallax scrolling, and they were struggling with all the usual janking issues that you get. And what they did was they created a sort of React rendering pipeline that renders to canvas instead of regular DOM, which is super clever, slightly crazy, but super clever. So I'm going to start looking at React Native now, and this is actually a React Native component rather than a React component. And hopefully, if your memory is good enough and you remember what it looked like for the HTML version, you'll look at this and go, wow, it's almost exactly the same. And the only thing that's different, the subtle difference, is the render function is returning some slightly different elements here. We've got a view element and a text element and a touchable highlight element. Rather than returning DOM elements, we're returning some other kind of representation of the UI. And then I was going to demonstrate it, and the reason I'm not going to demonstrate it is because I'm a bit of a coward, because I'm actually demonstrating another app, and I have a feeling that if I try to switch between the apps, it'll all fall apart. So I'm just going to do one demo, not two. So how does React Native work? Well, it's actually quite simple, he says, because he didn't write it. But it is actually quite simple. What they've done is the React framework is running within JavaScript core. So JavaScript core is something that was introduced in, I think, iOS 8 or something like that. It's basically a JavaScript runtime or virtual machine that can run outside of a web view. So you no longer have the constraints of a web view. You've got a proper JavaScript machine. And your application runs within that JavaScript machine, and it creates rather than a virtual DOM, a virtual UIKit view hierarchy. And UIKit in iOS is the out-of-the-box UI framework. So it maintains this virtual hierarchy, and what happens is each time it renders, it sends updates to, marshals it to the UI thread and renders the real UIKit user interface. So there's some smart, clever stuff going on there, but fundamentally it's actually quite simple. And as a result, as a React Native developer, you get exactly the same developer experience that you do with web-based applications. So you get the command R refresh to reload changes. Now, in the web world, that's pretty cool. In the mobile world, it's even more cool because if you're doing iOS development with Xcode, the build cycles are actually quite long. You've got to build, and then you've actually got to send it across to your device if you're using a real device. So the developer cycles are actually quite long. This drastically reduces the developer cycles. You've also got things like live reload as well, so you can have watchers set up so that if you change the code, it will immediately reload. You've got Chrome developer tools, so you've got exactly the same familiarity. You can add breakpoints. And then you've got the never-ending sort of story of all the cool stuff that you can add on, so NPM, Babel, Webpack, and whatever else you wish to throw at it is at your disposal. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate a little bit of an application. So I wasn't quite as organised as Jack. I haven't got lots and lots of slides where I cut and paste little bits of the code. I'm actually just going to delve directly into the code. So hopefully this should work. So what I'm going to do. Is that good enough to see? Yeah. It's got my Meetup API key in it, so please ignore it. So the application I'm going to show you is one that I quickly threw together a few days ago, just so I could refresh my memory about how React Native actually works, because it's been a little while since I last played with it. So this is an application, and I'll do a risky thing. I'll refresh it. So what it does is it makes a couple of API calls to Meetup. It loads first the metadata relating to the Bristol.js meetup, and then after that it makes another API request to obtain the list of meetings. And here you can see them being rendered. And as you can see, there's 16 people that are really keen to come along in 5 months' time. You can tap on a particular event and see the details. This will be in the App Store soon.
It's already better than the current one.
It's awesome. It's brilliant. It's cross-platform too. It's cool. So what I'm going to do is quickly give you a tour of the app, and hopefully this will start to look a bit familiar now, because you're going to start seeing things that you've seen over and over again, which, if you've never done iOS development and I showed you Objective-C, you'd leave the room now. Seriously, you would. Have we got any iOS developers here? Okay, so I'm quite safe to be rude about your language. Swift is awesome though, I love Swift. Okay, so let's have a look at, where should we start? Let's have a look at the application entry point. So at the start, all we're doing is we're registering a React, the name of our application and passing it a React component. That's it. So this is the bootstrapping of our application. So I'll pop straight over to the application itself. So this is a React component. Now, I'm using the ES 2015 class syntax, just my personal preference here. So here's the constructor of my top level component. And what it's doing initially is setting the state. So this is another way to set the initial state of the component. And I'm saying my initial state is that we're currently going to be loading the data, and I've got a little message here. If I pop back to the application, what you can see is we've got a little message that flips from loading meetup details to loading event listings, just so you get a bit of an idea of the progress. Now, because React is very much a view component, view components are by far the best place to put your logic. Wasn't that the way it went? Something like that. Yeah. So in the constructor of my component, I'm putting in my AJAX requests, which you all should be doing. So the first thing it does is it gets the group information, and I'm just going to quickly pop over to the API code. One of the things that I've found personally in the JavaScript code I've been writing in the past year is it's changed quite a bit, and it's been influenced quite a bit by ES 2015 and the changes. Was it 2016? The changes that have occurred. I found myself writing much more functional JavaScript, and as you can see here, what I'm doing is taking the fetch function and wrapping it up into my own little API request where I have a URL and some query string parameters. So a nice little function that wraps that up. And then I wrap up the meetup API requests again in another small little functions that sort of, you get the onion skinning effect of one function wrapping the other. So I get a nice little way of creating my own API. And again, that's my API key, please ignore it. Yeah, that's no problem. I'll change my password after this. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm getting the information from the Bristol.js meetup, and then what I'm doing as a side effect, yeah, I'm going function crazy here. Side effects is a function that returns a function. What that does is it allows you, when you're chaining promises together, what it does is it allows you to perform a side effect and return the result that was previously returned. So you can, normally when you do a then followed by then, you have to return the next promise or the transformed result. This allows you to do a little side effect. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting the state to inform the user of what's being loaded next. And the cool thing here, this being React, is I don't have to tell React that it needs to re-render or what's being re-rendered. And React takes care of that. All I'm doing is expressing that the state of my application has changed, and React Native are taking care of everything else. The next thing I'm doing is I'm getting the events, and again, I'm setting the state. And this time I'm setting it so that we're no longer in the loading state, and I'm providing it with a list of groups. So then if we look at the render method of my application, what it's doing is it's got at the top level, it's deciding which component to render. So if we're in the loading state, it's rendering the loading screen component and passing it as a message the loading message from the state, or if we're no longer in the loading state, I'm rendering the home screen. So again, everything you've seen here is just React. Nothing you've seen so far is React Native specific. So what I'm going to do is pop over to the loading screen and start to show you some of the things which are a little bit more React Native specific. So here again, this is something you're familiar with. This is a stateless functional component. And again, my preference is very much to use arrow functions. It keeps it as concise as possible. But I'm not going to go into this in much detail. You should understand that by now if you're paying attention. The interesting thing here is the styles. So what you see here is something that will look immediately familiar to you. This is very much like CSS, and the important thing here is flex. We've got flexbox. Now, if you've ever done any iOS development, iOS has got a slightly peculiar way of performing layout. Originally, iOS developers didn't have to worry about layout because they only had 2 or 3 form factors, but that unfortunately went away with the iPad mini, the iPhone 6 Plus. iOS developers had to start worrying about layout. And the solution they had is a constraints-based layout mechanism called auto layout. And what that means is, on your UI elements, you can provide a whole host of different constraints. You can say, for this UI element, make sure that it's always 20 pixels to the left of this one. Or this one, I want to maintain the aspect ratio. It sounds great in principle. It's really horrible in practice because it's very easy to come up with a set of constraints which are entirely conflicting, and the whole thing just falls apart. Flexbox is much better, and with React Native you get Flexbox. So what's happening here is React Native has well, this is the funny thing. React Native, the developers of React Native re-implemented Flexbox in JavaScript. They then transpiled it to Objective-C, so that then in Objective-C they can perform Flexbox layout and then just tell all the UI elements where they should be positioned. It's a crazy idea, but works really, really well. So again, this is something that's familiar to web developers and a big productivity gain for iOS developers. So that's Flexbox layout. You're all keeping up with me? Just about. Cool. So that's our loading screen. The next thing I'm going to show you is the home screen. So just to refresh the application again for the risk, you've got the loading screen, and when the application state transitions so that it's no longer loading, we're rendering a completely different component. And here we're going to see a lot more React Native specific code. So the home screen is primarily rendered via a Navigator iOS component. So I haven't really told you much about the particular DOM that's being rendered here. So you've seen previously in the previous files, you've seen things like views and text, and they almost map one-to-one directly with native UIKit view components. They have thin wrappers around them to enable them to communicate with React Native, but they are effectively built-in UIKit components. Navigator iOS is exactly that. So if you're doing the classic iOS application where you have a list of things, you want to tap on something, it will do a slide transition, you have a back button, and it will keep a stack. You have a UI navigation controller, is the native UIKit component. Navigator iOS is the React Native wrapper around that. So once you start doing React Native, you are going to have to start becoming familiar with slightly different UI components, but you're still expressing it very much in a React fashion. One thing you might have spotted here is that there's a clue in the name. This is very much an iOS specific component. So if you're writing React Native applications and you want to target both iOS and Android, it doesn't give you that for free. It's not a silver bullet that will do that. You're going to have to construct different UIs for Android and iOS. Although having said that, there are some pure React Native components that will work on both, but it's still something you have to be concerned about. So the home screen, we've got a Navigator iOS component. That's what gives me my basic shell of navigation. In the initial route, so this is a little bit like your sort of standard web routing, we're rendering an event list. And again, in the event list, we're going to see some things which are very React Native specific. So here we're rendering a list view, and it has a concept of a data source. And a list view is a very thin wrapper over the top of, I think it's using UI table view underneath, but what iOS does in order to get very, very smooth scrolling is they have a built-in component that allows you to render cells and it will then recycle the cells for you. So in order to get exactly the same render performance with React Native, they have a thin wrapper over that, and that's called the list view. And what that does mean is you've got some slightly yucky looking stuff for maintaining a data source. It doesn't look like terribly pure sort of React code. But again, it's pretty familiar. So then if we drill down even further, I'm going to stop going into all the details soon because things are going to start getting a little bit samey after a while. This is the actual list view items. So each of the items in the list are rendered by an event list item component. And again, this is all stuff you've seen before. What I want to show you now is actually some of the really big developer productivity gains that you can achieve. So one of the things that you really benefit from with React development and web development in general is fast iterations. In the world of mobile, you just don't get fast iterations. I've already shown you how reloading code is very, very fast. And if I was doing that actually on my phone, it would be just as fast, which is great. But you can actually make it work even faster. And for this, I'm just going to pull up. So, okay, I'm on live reload, so this is the standard sort of thing. If I go to the home screen, I should, fingers crossed, be able to make a change, and it will automatically reload, which is pretty cool. It's not bad. But this application has something in common with quite a lot of applications. If I'm developing on a screen that, to navigate to that screen, I've got to make a few network requests, or I've got to fill in a few form fields along the way. The development, even though it reloads very quickly, my development cycles aren't so great because I've still got to navigate back to that original location. So both ReactJS and React Native have something which is really awesome that I'm just going to try to show you. What I'm going to do is enable hot reloading, and it really is quite hot. It really is. So with hot reload, again, because of the very functional nature of React, your component is a pure function of the application state, and the way that you express your application state is very formal. There's a state object. Whereas in things like Angular, it has a similar concept, but the state isn't formalized as a specific property. Your state can be scattered around and expressed in many different ways. Now with React, because the state is a single property, it means you can actually tease the two apart. You can pull the state out of the component. And what that means is you can change your render logic of your component while maintaining the state. And the thing that makes that work is, has anyone come across Webpack's hot module reload? A few people. Okay, so one of the cool things about Webpack is hot module reload. What that enables you to do is any JavaScript module, you can quite easily make it into a hot reloading module, so that if you make any changes, it will just hot swap that module, which is really cool. If you've got some application logic that you want to just hot swap, it will make that really easy. What we're doing with React hot module reload is we're specifically doing that for the UI. So I'll stop waffling and just try to make it work. So if I change this back to Bristol.js and switch back, you'll see the title changed immediately whilst maintaining the application state. I could, let's try to do something a bit more interesting. So if I go to my event list item and I change the font size and quickly tap back, it updates. And that is pretty amazing. That is the kind of productivity that you can only dream of in mobile application development. And it's not just important in mobile application development, it's really important in web application development. Where I work, we tend to write financial applications, we write quite complicated applications, and the typical startup of the application involves doing all kinds of things. It will, for example, load the user preferences, it will download maybe a whole list of financial instruments, it will set up a whole load of streaming connections. So even if you can get your development build and your unit test really, really fast, the process of actually logging in and navigating back to the place that you're iterating on is very, very slow. Whereas with hot reload, you can get right back to those very, very quick development cycles without having to go through the whole login process, which is absolutely fantastic. And again, it's something that they're starting to look at. I've seen someone hack it into Angular. I have a feeling that this is just the way web development and mobile development is going to go. Once you've tasted this, you don't want to go back. And that's pretty much it for the application. I haven't put the code anywhere because it's far too ugly to share. So that's the Meetup application. One thing I should have done right back at the very beginning is told you how to create your own React Native application. And as you can imagine, it's pretty much the way that you would bootstrap and scaffold any other application. React Native has its own CLI. It's a bit like Yeoman and so on. It's one of these things for creating all the scaffolding. Now I'm going to deviate slightly from Jack's suggestion. He suggested don't use scaffolding, build your own. You would be doing this for a long time with React Native because you don't really want to create your own Xcode build. That would be crazy. So this will actually create the Xcode project and the Xcode build and all the stuff that you just really don't want to touch. And once you've created it, it looks like a familiar JavaScript project. You'll have a packaged JSON with a start script. So to start up the React Native development server, it's just the same as starting up your web development server. It's npm start. You've got your dependencies. I love the way that React and React Native are not doing version 1 releases yet. God bless them. Yeah, in the development server, and off you go. And then I'll give you a tour of the app, which I've already got. And that's the app. This is my backup plan for if the network doesn't work. And finally, Redux. Again, I was going to talk, and I was planning on trying to re-implement the application in Redux. I'll just leave it as if you want to find out more about a really good way to structure your React applications, definitely have a look at Redux. And what Redux does is it formalizes the way that your application state evolves in a very functional fashion. So what it does is your application state is immutable. The only way to mutate it is to apply an action to it. When you apply an action to your state, you end up in a new state. It sounds trivial, it sounds very, very simple, but by applying that in a very formal fashion, you can do some really cool things. And one thing you should look up is time travel. What it does is, once you're able to write your application in such a way that state transitions are as a result of a series of actions, you can record those actions and replay those actions. You can roll back actions. So what you can do, for example, is if you're developing a form-based application and you get halfway through filling it in and you realize that an earlier bit of logic or validation logic was wrong, what you can do is you can literally roll back your actions, you can make a change to your code, it'll be hot reloaded, you can replay the actions and get back to where you were, having corrected the fault. It's amazing. So, I want to wrap up by just sharing, the good parts and the bad parts of React Native. I think it's pretty awesome, but at the same time, every cloud has a silver lining. No, that's not the right analogy. Yeah, every silver lining has a cloud. That's the one. So yeah, the good parts. I think I could go over all the little bits and pieces, the little details, but I think the thing that really sums it up for me is this idea that when they launched it, they used this phrase time and time again: learn once, use everywhere. So learn how to write JavaScript applications, React applications, learn how to use your development tooling and use it everywhere. Use it for React Native. Use it with Electron for writing your desktop applications. So it's not about writing an application that will work in all these contexts. It's about taking your skills and using them in all these various different contexts. React Native, the bad bits. As I said, it's not all roses. And I think, again, I'd just sum it up with one point. Joel Spolsky had a really good blog post where he mentioned all non-trivial abstractions to some degree are leaky. And that is incredibly true. Anyone who's used a complex framework that is some form of abstraction over the top of another framework or a library will certainly understand this. So how might a leak manifest itself within React Native? The first one is obviously bugs in the abstraction layer. So you're sitting on top of an abstraction layer, which is an abstraction layer over iOS development. You really should be using Objective-C, but you don't want to because it's horrible. So you're using React Native instead. But you're using a big layer and there might be bugs in it. And if you don't know Objective-C and there's a bug in there, you might not have the capabilities or be crazy enough to try to fix it. So that's a potential leak in this abstraction. Another one is third-party dependencies. So one of the problems that React Native may or may not face is what happens when iOS 9, iOS 10, iOS 11 comes out. It has affected similar technologies in the past. So Xamarin, for example, have had to make some very quick changes to make their frameworks compatible with newer versions of iOS. React Native, I think, is probably a little less at risk there because it's using entirely conventional technologies, but it's using JavaScript core rather than compiling to a native binary. So it's a little bit safer, but it's still a concern. Another one is abstraction layers hide features, and this is one you'll probably hit on far more often with React Native. There will be features and capabilities. React Native will no doubt cover you for all of the standard UI kit stuff, all the standard APIs. But what happens when your designer comes along and says, oh, we want this really great slide out effect. I've been onto GitHub, there's a fantastic control that will do it for you. And you go, that's an Objective-C control. I'm using React Native, I can't use that. That's one of the areas where the abstraction layer will be hiding a feature that you really want to use. And again, being open source, there are ways to hook up iOS components and make them work with React Native. It's relatively easy to do. There's a few horrible macros that you've got to write, but it works. But again, it's a valid concern. And probably the biggest one is, will Facebook still be using React Native in 1-2 years' time? If you've followed the way that Facebook does mobile development over the years, they've been quite fickle. They've changed their mind a few times. They've used all kinds of things from hybrid applications. They publicly dropped HTML5 and went native. They're now doing React Native. And I must admit, when I first saw React Native, I was a little bit pessimistic about whether it was something that I could personally recommend. Because I work as a consultant, you feel quite bad if you recommend the technology and then a year later it disappears. So I'm naturally quite cautious. So when I first started looking at React Native, I was very cautious. And I probably wouldn't use it when writing code with someone else's money. But I must admit, in the past few months, my opinion of React Native has changed quite a bit. And that's because it seems to have actually obtained quite a high level of community traction. There's a very strong community behind React Native. It's being used quite widely within Facebook. It's moving from team to team. But it was just a week ago that they published a blog post on Facebook Developer Blog where they did a kind of look back at the past year in React Native, and it really has only been a year. And now 50% of the pull requests on the React Native repository come from people outside of Facebook. There's a great community interest in there. Also, Microsoft have started working on support, so you'll soon be able to do React Native for the Windows platform if you so wish. So my perspective on React Native has changed from one of cautious optimism to, yeah, I think it's ready to use. I think it's a pretty low-risk technology to invest in. So finally, React Native, what does it actually mean for you guys, and possibly you guys and developers in general? If you're a native iOS developer, then not much. If you're doing native iOS, you only ever want to do native, then there's no real reason to move to React Native. You'd have to learn far too much. There's actually a Swift React library which does exactly the same functional concepts in Swift. If you're an Ionic or a HTML5 developer, React Native really is a viable alternative. You'll get the familiarity you get with HTML5-based mobile applications, but you'll get the native user interface, which is great. If you're a web developer and you want to look at doing mobile development, I think React Native is a very easy route in at the moment. Finally, if you're using one of the other cross-platform technologies like Xamarin, Xamarin's more mature, it's been around for longer, it's been sort of battle-tested, but personally I think React Native is much more elegant. So finally, my final sort of takeaway is to me personally, React Native is a really exciting mix of technologies and techniques. It's innovative and it's just a lot of fun. I've personally enjoyed using it a lot. So thank you very much.